What if the person you dismiss every day holds the key to saving everything you hold dear? What if the quiet administrator filing your reports once danced with death at the edge of space itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and smoothed down her conservative cardigan as she walked through the sterile corridors of Peterson Space Force Base. At 32, she had perfected the art of institutional invisibility, moving through Building 47's administrative wing with the unremarkable efficiency of someone who understood that anonymity was its own form of armor. Her sensible flats clicked softly against polished linoleum as she balanced a stack of mission briefings against her hip, navigating toward the conference room where another morning of being overlooked awaited. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. As Sarah entered Conference Room C, a windowless space that smelled of stale coffee and recycled air, she began arranging folders around the oval table with methodical precision, each document positioned exactly 3 inches from the table's edge. Her movements carried the unconscious discipline of someone who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, though none of her colleagues would ever suspect such depths beneath her unremarkable exterior. Commander Jake Thompson strode through the door at precisely 0800 hours, his space operations uniform crisp enough to cut glass. Behind him followed his usual entourage of rising stars from the Satellite Warfare Division, their confident chatter filling the room with technical jargon and the casual arrogance of officers who had never doubted their place in the military hierarchy. Sarah retreated to her corner desk, opening her laptop to begin transcribing the morning briefing while remaining as invisible as the institutional furniture that surrounded her. "Martinez coffee," Commander Thompson announced without looking in her direction, his voice carrying the dismissive tone reserved for support staff who existed solely to facilitate the important work of real military professionals. Sarah nodded silently and moved toward the coffee station, her practiced hands preparing the brew while her trained ears automatically cataloged every word of the conversation unfolding behind her. Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes was discussing orbital mechanics with the enthusiasm of someone eager to impress her superiors, her voice rising above the general discussion as she explained theoretical satellite positioning strategies. Sarah's hands paused for the briefest moment as she heard Hayes describe a particularly complex orbital insertion maneuver, one that Sarah had personally executed 17 times in environments where theoretical knowledge wasn't sufficient for survival. But Sarah Martinez, Senior Administrative Coordinator, wasn't supposed to understand anything more complicated than filing systems and meeting schedules. Captain David Chun joined the conversation with his usual academic precision, spreading satellite imagery across the conference table while explaining the defensive capabilities of various space-based assets. His words carried the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours studying orbital warfare theory, though Sarah knew from his file that his actual space experience consisted entirely of simulator sessions and classroom exercises. She continued preparing coffee while unconsciously calculating the real-world limitations of the defensive systems Chien was describing, systems she had tested beyond their theoretical parameters in missions that officially had never occurred. The morning briefing focused on recent intelligence suggesting hostile activities in geosynchronous orbit, discussions of potential threats to critical satellite infrastructure, and theoretical responses to various attack scenarios. Commander Thompson dominated the conversation with his characteristic blend of technical competence and institutional authority, clearly establishing himself as the subject matter expert on all things related to space operations. His subordinates nodded appropriately and asked carefully crafted questions, designed to demonstrate their own understanding while acknowledging his superior knowledge. Sarah served coffee with the same invisible efficiency she brought to every task, moving around the table like a ghost while absorbing every detail of conversations about orbital strike capabilities, kinetic bombardment systems, and the vulnerability of American satellite networks. The officers discussed these threats with the academic detachment of people who understood the theory, but had never faced the terrifying reality of combat at the edge of space itself. Through the conference room's single window, Sarah could see the Rocky Mountains rising beyond Colorado Springs, their snow-capped peaks catching the morning light. 4 years ago, she had launched from a classified facility hidden among those same mountains, piloting experimental aircraft toward missions that pushed the boundaries between atmosphere and void. Now she filed reports about those missions. Her own classified exploits reduced to sanitized summaries that revealed nothing about the human cost of maintaining American superiority in the ultimate high ground. Her desk occupied the corner farthest from the main conference table, positioned perfectly for observing without being observed. Among her carefully arranged administrative supplies sat a small piece of space rock, a meteorite fragment no larger than a marble that she claimed was a gift from her nephew's geology class. In reality, it was a piece of debris from her final mission, a fragment of hostile satellite that had nearly ended her career and her life in the frozen darkness between Earth and stars. Commander Thompson concluded the morning briefing with assignments and scheduling for the week ahead, his confident demeanor reflecting absolute certainty in his command of the space operations domain. As the officers filed out discussing technical details and strategic implications, Sarah remained behind to clean up the conference room, collecting empty coffee cups and reorganizing materials with the same methodical care she applied to every aspect of her carefully constructed civilian identity. The quiet that followed their departure was familiar and comforting, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the soft clicking of her keyboard as she began transcribing the morning's discussions. Sarah Martinez, the invisible administrator, settled into another day of institutional anonymity, unaware that circumstances were already aligning to shatter the careful balance between her hidden past and her necessary present. The transformation began 3 days later when Commander Thompson decided that Building 47's administrative wing would serve as his personal showcase for visiting Pentagon officials. Sarah watched through her peripheral vision as a convoy of black sedans arrived in the parking lot, disgorging senior officers whose uniforms bore decorations she recognized from classified briefings she wasn't supposed to remember. Thompson had apparently concluded that demonstrating his command authority over support staff would impress his superiors, particularly when he could do so in front of someone he considered intellectually beneath his notice. Martinez, Thompson's voice cut across the office space with deliberate volume, ensuring that every person within earshot would witness what he clearly intended as a performance. Since we have distinguished visitors today, I want you to understand that real space operations require precision and intelligence that support personnel don't typically possess. His words carried the condescending patience of someone explaining complex concepts to a child. Though Sarah had been calculating orbital mechanics before Thompson had graduated from basic training, Sarah nodded respectfully and continued organizing the briefing materials that Thompson would present to his Pentagon audience, her movements steady despite the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied public humiliation. She had endured worse treatment during survival training exercises, survived interrogation scenarios that would have broken most people, and maintained operational security under circumstances that these officers couldn't imagine. But this felt different because it came from people who wore the same uniform she had once worn with pride. General Patricia Holbrook entered the conference room with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command authority, her weathered face and multiple combat ribbons suggesting extensive operational experience. Behind her followed a delegation of senior Pentagon officials whose presence transformed the usual morning briefing into something approaching a formal presentation. Thompson straightened his uniform and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed demonstration of his expertise, with Sarah serving as his unwitting prop in a carefully orchestrated display of institutional hierarchy. "As you can see, General Holbrook," Thompson announced while gesturing dismissively toward Sarah, "our administrative staff handles the routine paperwork while qualified officers focus on the complex strategic thinking that space operations demand." He moved to the wall-mounted display showing satellite positioning data, his pointer tracking across orbital pathways with theatrical precision. These support personnel are essential for basic organizational tasks, but naturally they lack the technical background to understand what they're actually processing. Sarah continued arranging documents while Thompson explained orbital dynamics to an audience that included officers who had personally overseen some of the most classified space operations in military history. His lecture covered theoretical satellite positioning, hypothetical threat scenarios, and textbook responses to various contingencies, all delivered with the confidence of someone who had never actually implemented any of the strategies he was describing. Lieutenant Hayes joined the presentation with obvious enthusiasm, clearly hoping to impress the visiting officials with her theoretical knowledge of space-based warfare systems. "The defensive capabilities of our current satellite network rely on coordinated positioning that requires constant mathematical recalculation," she explained while spreading technical diagrams across the conference table. "These calculations are far beyond the comprehension of administrative personnel, which is why qualified officers must oversee every aspect of strategic planning." Sarah's pen paused for a fraction of a second as she recognized the orbital positioning equations Hayes was displaying. Mathematical formulas that Sarah had memorized through practical application during missions where incorrect calculations meant certain death in the vacuum of space. The young lieutenant was explaining theoretical concepts that Sarah had executed in real-world conditions, using data that had been collected during flights that Hayes would never be briefed about. The humiliation escalated when Thompson began using Sarah as a direct example of civilian incompetence, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his performance for the Pentagon audience. "Martinez here probably thinks satellites stay in orbit through some kind of magic," he announced with cruel amusement. "She likely imagines that space operations involve pushing buttons and hoping for the best, rather than the complex physics and strategic thinking that actual space professionals understand." General Holbrook watched this display with an expression of growing discomfort, though military protocol prevented her from interrupting a subordinate's briefing without cause. The other Pentagon officials shifted uneasily in their seats as Thompson's demonstration of superiority became increasingly personal and unnecessarily cruel. "Look at her taking notes," Thompson continued, pointing directly at Sarah while she transcribed his comments with professional detachment. "She's probably writing down words she doesn't understand, trying to memorize terminology that she never actually comprehend. This is exactly why space operations require officers with advanced education and specialized training, rather than clerks who process paperwork without understanding its significance." Captain Chun contributed to the performance by explaining the theoretical principles of orbital mechanics with exaggerated simplicity, ostensibly for Sarah's benefit, but clearly intended to demonstrate the vast intellectual gap between trained military professionals and administrative support staff. "These are called orbital insertion trajectories," he said while pointing to technical diagrams with patronizing patience. "They represent the mathematical calculations required to position satellites in specific locations around Earth. I don't expect you to understand the physics involved, but perhaps you can at least learn the basic terminology." Sarah nodded politely while transcribing explanations of concepts she had mastered at both theoretical and practical levels before these officers had been commissioned. She absorbed lectures about gravitational mechanics, orbital decay calculations, and space-based weapon systems, information she had applied in environments where theoretical knowledge wasn't sufficient for survival against enemies who existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. The cruelest moment came when Thompson discovered the meteorite fragment on Sarah's desk, the small piece of space rock that represented her only visible connection to a career that had been officially erased. "Well, well," Thompson said with malicious delight as he picked up the fragment, holding it where the entire room could see. "Our administrator has space rocks. Let me guess, you bought this at the gift shop, trying to feel connected to real space operations." Sarah's face remained neutral, but her hand unconsciously moved toward the empty space where the fragment had been. That piece of debris had been collected during her final classified mission, a fragment of hostile satellite that had nearly cost her life in combat at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. It represented achievements that exceeded anything in Thompson's service record, but Sarah couldn't defend its significance without revealing everything she had worked to keep hidden. "It's probably from some museum display," Thompson continued. Encouraged by Sarah's silence and the attentive audience of Pentagon officials, support personnel love to collect space-themed souvenirs because it makes them feel connected to missions they could never actually perform. Notice how she pretends. It has special meaning, even though she's never been closer to space than the planetarium at the local science museum. The systematic degradation continued as Thompson brought in additional junior officers, specifically to witness his educational sessions with the ignorant administrator. He scheduled these demonstrations during Sarah's shifts, ensuring maximum audience for his displays of intellectual superiority over someone he considered beneath professional notice. "Watch this," Thompson would tell visiting officers while Sarah worked nearby. "I'm going to explain basic spacecraft maneuvering to our civilian friend here." Notice how she nods and pretends to understand, even though the concepts are completely beyond her educational background. Sarah endured detailed explanations of thruster mechanics, attitude control systems, orbital rendezvous procedures, and space-based weapons deployment. Technology she had operated, improved, and survived through practical application in missions that remained classified beyond these officers' security clearances. Thompson's lectures covered theoretical spacecraft operation, hypothetical combat scenarios, and textbook responses to various space-based threats, all delivered with the confidence of someone who had never actually faced the terrifying reality of combat in zero gravity. Each morning brought fresh opportunities for Thompson to demonstrate his superiority over someone he considered intellectually inferior. Sarah absorbed it all with the stoic endurance she had learned during survival training, during resistance exercises, during missions where maintaining cover was more important than personal dignity. She understood something that Thompson had never learned. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from allowing others to underestimate you, and sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who appears completely harmless. The psychological warfare reached its peak when Thompson began bringing printed technical manuals to support his educational efforts, spreading classified documents across his desk while loudly explaining concepts that Sarah had helped develop during her years as an experimental test pilot. The irony was lost on everyone except Sarah herself, who recognized her own mission reports among the materials Thompson was using to demonstrate her supposed ignorance. But Sarah Martinez, senior administrative coordinator, wasn't supposed to know any of this. So she listened politely, nodded at appropriate intervals, and continued serving coffee to people who had no idea they were humiliating someone whose forgotten accomplishments exceeded their most ambitious career goals. The storm Thompson was creating with his systematic cruelty was about to encounter a force of nature he couldn't possibly comprehend. And when that collision finally occurred, he would discover that some people's true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when revealing them becomes absolutely necessary. The escalation began during the monthly strategic assessment meeting when Thompson decided to transform Sarah's humiliation into a teaching tool for junior officers. The conference room filled with eager lieutenants and captains, all hoping to learn from their superiors' expertise while witnessing his masterful handling of support personnel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah continued her usual tasks of document preparation and coffee service, but now she performed them under the scrutinizing gaze of an audience specifically assembled to observe her supposed inadequacy. Today we're going to discuss something crucial to military leadership, Thompson announced to his gathered subordinates, his voice carrying the authority of someone about to impart wisdom earned through years of experience. The importance of recognizing intellectual limitations in support staff and managing expectations accordingly. He gestured toward Sarah with the casual dismissiveness of someone pointing out a piece of equipment. Our administrator here represents a perfect example of why technical discussions must be simplified when civilian personnel are present. Lieutenant Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest, clearly hoping to absorb leadership lessons that would advance her own career. Behind her, Captain Chun and several other junior officers prepared to take notes on Thompson's demonstration of proper personnel management techniques. Sarah organized briefing materials with mechanical precision, her expression neutral while every instinct screamed against the public degradation she was being forced to endure. "Martinez," Thompson called out sharply, snapping his fingers to ensure he had her attention and that of his audience. "Since you've been exposed to our discussions about orbital mechanics for months now, perhaps you'd like to share your expert opinion on geosynchronous satellite positioning." The question dripped with sarcasm so thick that several junior officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, though none dared challenge their superiors' methods. Sarah approached the table carrying her notepad, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the familiar burning sensation in her chest that accompanied moments of professional humiliation. "I wouldn't presume to have opinions about subjects beyond my training, sir," she replied with the practiced humility she had perfected over 4 years of institutional invisibility. "How refreshingly honest," Thompson said with exaggerated approval, playing to his audience of subordinates who were learning to associate cruelty with leadership effectiveness. "At least you recognize your limitations, unlike some people who mistake exposure to technical terminology for actual understanding." He turned to address his officers directly, using Sarah's presence as a convenient object lesson in civilian inadequacy. The systematic humiliation expanded beyond simple mockery into elaborate educational theater designed to demonstrate Thompson's intellectual superiority to anyone within hearing range. He began scheduling what he called cross-training sessions where junior officers would observe proper techniques for communicating complex concepts to intellectually limited support staff. Sarah became an unwilling participant in these demonstrations, forced to play the role of confused civilian while Thompson explained basic physics concepts with patronizing patience. "These are called orbital velocities," Thompson announced during one particularly painful session, pointing to equations that Sarah had memorized through practical application during missions where mathematical errors meant certain death. "They represent the speeds required for objects to maintain stable orbits around Earth. The calculations involve complex physics that require advanced education to understand properly." Sarah nodded politely while Thompson explained concepts she had mastered at theoretical and practical levels before he had completed his first space operations course. She listened to lectures about gravitational mechanics that she had applied in environments where theoretical knowledge wasn't sufficient for survival against enemies operating beyond conventional physics. But Sarah Martinez, the administrative coordinator, wasn't supposed to understand anything more complicated than filing systems and meeting schedules. The psychological assault intensified when Thompson discovered Sarah's habit of unconsciously tracking aircraft overhead whenever military transports passed during their training flights. Sarah had developed this reflex during years of experimental piloting, automatically calculating altitude, speed, and trajectory based on engine signatures and flight patterns. But to Thompson, her upward glances represented another opportunity to demonstrate her civilian ignorance to his growing audience of subordinates. "Look at her," Thompson said with cruel amusement as Sarah's eyes briefly followed a C-130 transport passing overhead during an outdoor briefing session. "She's probably wondering if that's a UFO or some kind of experimental aircraft." Civilians always think any military hardware they can't immediately identify must be mysterious and classified. His comment generated dutiful laughter from junior officers who were learning to mirror their superiors' attitudes toward support personnel. But Major Lisa Rodriguez, who had been observing these demonstrations with growing discomfort, noticed something that Thompson missed entirely. Sarah's tracking movements were too precise, too professional for someone with civilian aviation experience. Her eyes had followed the aircraft's flight path with mathematical accuracy, automatically compensating for wind drift and calculating performance parameters that required extensive training to recognize. When the transport passed beyond visual range, Sarah's gaze had returned to ground level at exactly the moment when someone with advanced acoustic training would have lost the engine signature. The humiliation reached new depths when Thompson began bringing visiting officers specifically to witness his educational sessions with the ignorant administrator. Representatives from other space operations commands would arrive for routine coordination meetings, only to find themselves invited to observe Thompson's masterful handling of civilian personnel. Sarah served coffee and organized documents, while enduring explanations of space-based weapons systems that she had personally tested beyond their theoretical limitations. "Our administrative staff requires constant guidance to understand even basic concepts," Thompson explained to a visiting colonel from Peterson Space Force Base. "Watch how she nods and pretends to comprehend when I discuss satellite maneuvering techniques, even though the physics involved are completely beyond her educational background." His demonstration included detailed explanations of attitude control systems that Sarah had operated during combat missions that remained classified beyond the security clearances of everyone present. Dr. Amanda Foster, a civilian contractor specializing in orbital mechanics, attended one of these sessions and witnessed something that made her question everything she thought she knew about military personnel management. Sarah was serving refreshments when Dr. Foster mentioned theoretical problems with current satellite shielding technologies, discussing research challenges that had puzzled engineers for months. Sarah's response was so subtle that most people missed it entirely, but Dr. Foster caught the brief moment when Sarah's expression showed recognition, followed by what appeared to be internal calculation. "The electromagnetic interference patterns you're describing," Sarah said quietly while refilling Dr. Foster's coffee cup, "might be resolved through adaptive frequency modulation combined with polarization rotation." The comment was delivered so naturally, so casually, that it took several seconds for Dr. Foster to process what she had just heard. The solution Sarah suggested wasn't just technically sophisticated. It represented research that was classified at levels requiring special security clearances. Sarah seemed to realize her mistake immediately, her face showing the controlled panic of someone who had accidentally revealed information they weren't supposed to possess. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, retreating toward her desk. "I must have misunderstood your conversation. I don't know anything about technical subjects." But the damage was already done. Dr. Foster knew that adaptive frequency modulation research was being conducted at only 2 facilities worldwide, both of which required security clearances that took years to obtain. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Sarah encountered Lieutenant Mark Stevens, a young officer struggling with orbital rendezvous calculations during his lunch break. Sarah had been cleaning nearby tables when she noticed Stevens' frustration with trajectory equations that refused to balance correctly. Without thinking, she glanced at his calculations and immediately spotted the error he had been wrestling with for days. Stevens had been using standard atmospheric density values, instead of adjusting for altitude-specific variations in his orbital insertion calculations. Sarah reached over and made a small notation in the margin of his notebook, correcting the mathematical error with the precision of someone who had performed similar calculations hundreds of times under combat conditions. "Your atmospheric compensation is incorrect," Sarah said quietly, then caught herself mid-sentence. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched your papers." But Stevens was staring at the corrected equation with growing amazement. Sarah's adjustment hadn't just solved his problem. It had revealed a mathematical elegance that transformed complex orbital mechanics into intuitive physics. "How did you know that?" Stevens asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's response was carefully neutral, though her eyes showed a flicker of something that Major Rodriguez was beginning to recognize as carefully suppressed expertise. "Lucky guess. I should return to my duties." But Stevens wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He had seen the way Sarah's eyes had scanned his entire calculation matrix, identifying the critical error with instant recognition that suggested extensive experience with orbital mechanics. The mathematical notation she had used employed shorthand, symbols that weren't taught in basic space operations courses, techniques that required advanced training to master. Thompson, who had witnessed this exchange from across the room, seized upon it as another opportunity to demonstrate Sarah's civilian presumption. "Martinez," he called out loudly enough for everyone in the office to hear, "I see you're now offering mathematical advice to qualified officers. Perhaps you'd like to explain to Lieutenant Stevens where you acquired your expertise in orbital mechanics." The question was delivered with such venomous sarcasm that conversations throughout the office stopped as personnel turned to witness what was clearly intended as public entertainment at Sarah's expense. Thompson was performing for an audience, demonstrating his authority over someone he considered intellectually inferior while teaching his subordinates proper techniques for maintaining hierarchy. Sarah approached Thompson's desk with her notepad, her expression carefully controlled despite the familiar tightness in her throat that accompanied these moments of systematic humiliation. "I don't have any expertise, sir. I made an error in judgment by commenting on matters beyond my understanding." "Indeed you did," Thompson replied with theatrical disapproval. "This is exactly why support personnel must remember their limitations and avoid interfering with the complex work of qualified officers. Your presumption in offering mathematical advice to Lieutenant Stevens demonstrates the kind of civilian arrogance that undermines military professionalism." But Major Rodriguez had been watching Sarah's mathematical notation with growing fascination, recognizing techniques that suggested training far beyond anything available to administrative personnel. The symbols Sarah had used were employed only in advanced orbital mechanics courses that required security clearances at levels Thompson himself didn't possess. Someone had taught Sarah mathematical shorthand that was used exclusively by experimental test pilots working on classified spacecraft development programs. The systematic cruelty continued with Thompson bringing additional witnesses to observe his educational sessions with the ignorant administrator. Sarah endured explanations of spacecraft life support systems that she had relied upon during missions beyond Earth's atmosphere, lectures about zero-gravity maneuvering techniques that she had mastered through practical application, and detailed discussions of space-based weapons technology that she had personally tested against hostile targets. Each session ended with Thompson's reminder that civilian support staff must recognize their intellectual limitations and avoid presuming to understand concepts that required advanced military training to comprehend. Sarah absorbed these lessons with the same stoic endurance she had learned during survival exercises, maintaining her cover despite the growing danger that someone would eventually recognize the inconsistencies in her carefully constructed identity. But the storm was building, and Sarah could feel the pressure mounting toward an inevitable breaking point where her hidden capabilities would either remain forever concealed or explode into visibility, with consequences that would shatter everyone's understanding of who she really was. Major Lisa Rodriguez had spent 15 years in military intelligence, developing an instinct for detecting inconsistencies that others overlooked. What began as casual observation of Thompson's cruel demonstrations had evolved into systematic analysis of Sarah Martinez's unconscious behaviors, and the pattern emerging defied logical explanation for someone with purely administrative background. Rodriguez found herself arriving early to meetings just to watch Sarah's preparation routines, documenting subtle anomalies that suggested training far beyond anything available to civilian support staff. The first major revelation came during a routine briefing about satellite vulnerability assessments when Dr. Amanda Foster presented technical data that had puzzled Pentagon analysts for weeks. Sarah was organizing materials near the projection screen when Dr. Foster displayed electromagnetic signature patterns from an unknown orbital object, explaining that conventional analysis had failed to identify the source or purpose of the unusual readings. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable to anyone trained in behavioral observation. Her pupils dilated slightly as she processed the data. Her breathing pattern shifted to the controlled rhythm that intelligence operatives use during high-stress information processing, and her body language indicated recognition rather than confusion. Most significantly, Sarah's eyes tracked across the electromagnetic patterns with the focused intensity of someone analyzing familiar rather than foreign technology. The entire sequence lasted less than 10 seconds, but Rodriguez caught every detail of Sarah's involuntary response to classified information. Dr. Foster continued her presentation while Sarah returned to her desk, apparently unaware that her brief moment of professional analysis had been witnessed by someone trained to detect exactly such anomalies. Rodriguez made careful notes in her personal observation log, adding this incident to a growing collection of behavioral inconsistencies that painted an increasingly impossible picture of Sarah Martinez's true background. The pattern became undeniable when Thompson scheduled a demonstration briefing for visiting officials from United States Space Command, bringing in Dr. Michael Park, a renowned expert in hypersonic flight dynamics. Dr. Park had been invited to discuss theoretical challenges in developing spacecraft capable of reaching orbital combat altitudes, presenting research problems that had stymied engineering teams at classified facilities across the country. Sarah served refreshments while Dr. Park explained mathematical obstacles that prevented conventional aircraft from achieving sustained flight at the edge of space. The atmospheric transition zone presents insurmountable challenges for current propulsion systems, Dr. Park explained to his audience of senior officers. We need breakthrough technology that can maintain control authority during the shift between aerodynamic and orbital flight regimes, but the engineering solutions remain purely theoretical. He displayed complex equations that represented years of unsuccessful research attempts, mathematical formulas that had frustrated the most brilliant aerospace engineers in the military. Sarah was collecting empty coffee cups when she paused beside Dr. Park's presentation materials, her trained eyes automatically scanning the mathematical equations displayed on his tablet. Without conscious thought, she began mentally working through the calculations that had stumped entire research teams, her brain processing fluid dynamics equations with the intuitive understanding that came from practical application rather than theoretical study. The boundary layer separation you're modeling, Sarah said quietly, addressing Dr. Park directly, could be managed through variable geometry intake systems combined with magnetohydrodynamic flow control. Her comment was delivered with the casual confidence of someone discussing routine engineering solutions, completely unaware that she had just proposed technology that existed only in the most classified research facilities. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Park stared at Sarah with undisguised shock because the solution she had suggested wasn't just technically sophisticated. It represented research that was classified beyond the security clearances of most people present. The specific combination of variable geometry systems and magnetohydrodynamic control existed only in theoretical papers that weren't available to the general public. Thompson's face showed complete bewilderment as he struggled to process what had just occurred. His systematic humiliation of the ignorant administrator had been interrupted by a display of technical knowledge that exceeded his own understanding of advanced aerospace engineering. "Martinez," he said slowly, his voice carrying dangerous undertones, "where exactly did you encounter magnetohydrodynamic flow control systems?" Sarah's face showed immediate recognition of her mistake, the controlled panic of someone who had accidentally revealed information they weren't supposed to possess. "I apologize, sir. I must have misunderstood the technical discussion. I have no knowledge of aerospace engineering." But her attempt at deflection only drew more attention to the impossibility of her previous comment. Dr. Park wasn't willing to dismiss Sarah's suggestion so easily because he recognized the genius of her proposed solution. "Miss Martinez, the technology you just described represents cutting-edge research that's being conducted at only 3 facilities worldwide. Could you elaborate on your understanding of magnetohydrodynamic principles?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb while Sarah searched for an explanation that wouldn't shatter her carefully maintained cover identity. She could see Thompson's expression shifting from confusion to suspicion, Dr. Park's scientific curiosity demanding answers she couldn't provide, and Major Rodriguez watching everything with the focused intensity of someone who had finally found the missing piece of a complex puzzle. "I occasionally read science magazines," Sarah said weakly, knowing that her explanation was completely inadequate for the level of technical sophistication she had just demonstrated. "Sometimes articles discuss theoretical concepts that sound similar to your research." But everyone in the room understood that general science publications didn't contain information about classified magnetohydrodynamic research programs. Major Rodriguez made the decision that would change everything when she approached Sarah. After the meeting, speaking quietly enough that their conversation couldn't be overheard by other personnel. "Ms. Martinez, I'd like to schedule a private discussion about your background and qualifications. There are some administrative details that require clarification." Sarah understood immediately that her cover identity was under serious investigation by someone with the training and authority to uncover information that officially didn't exist. "Of course, Major. I'm available whenever convenient for you." But both women knew that the upcoming conversation would determine whether Sarah's 4-year masquerade could survive scrutiny from military intelligence. The investigation began that afternoon when Rodriguez accessed personnel databases that required special authorization to review. Sarah Martinez's official file contained exactly the kind of unremarkable background information that suggested careful construction rather than authentic documentation. Her educational credentials were adequate, but not exceptional. Her work history showed steady employment in administrative positions, and her personal references checked out perfectly to anyone who didn't look too closely. But Rodriguez had been trained to look very closely indeed, and she began finding inconsistencies that painted an increasingly suspicious picture of Sarah's true identity. The Social Security number was authentic, but had been issued in a year that didn't match Sarah's stated birth date. Her educational transcripts showed grades that were consistent with administrative career goals, but the courses themselves included advanced mathematics and physics classes that seemed unnecessary for someone pursuing clerical work. Most significantly, Rodriguez discovered that Sarah's employment history contained a suspicious gap of nearly 6 months between her previous administrative position and her current job at Peterson Space Force Base. During that period, Sarah had apparently disappeared completely from all official records, existing in a bureaucratic limbo that suggested either identity fraud or something far more interesting. Rodriguez expanded her investigation into classified personnel databases. using her intelligence clearance to access information that revealed even more intriguing anomalies. Sarah's financial records showed regular deposits that were consistent with government employment, but the payments came from accounts that were associated with black budget operations rather than standard administrative payroll. Someone was funding Sarah's current lifestyle through channels typically reserved for deep cover operatives or assets requiring special protection. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez discovered a single document that had escaped proper classification review, a routine medical examination report that contained details about Sarah's physical condition that were completely inconsistent with civilian background. The medical data showed bone density levels that indicated extensive exposure to high G forces, cardiovascular conditioning that suggested regular operation in low oxygen environments, and specialized vaccinations that were administered only to personnel involved in classified space operations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the base medical officer who had conducted Sarah's initial employment physical, provided the final piece of evidence that Rodriguez needed to confirm her growing suspicions. Ms. Martinez has physiological markers that are extremely unusual for administrative personnel, Dr. Walsh explained during their confidential consultation. Her reaction times, spatial orientation abilities, and stress response patterns all indicate extensive training in high performance environments. Rodriguez pressed for more specific details about these unusual physiological markers, learning that Sarah's medical examination had revealed adaptations that were typically found only in experimental test pilots who had undergone specialized conditioning for extreme flight environments. Her inner ear structure showed modifications consistent with extended exposure to zero gravity. Her muscle fiber composition indicated training in environments requiring exceptional physical control, and her neurological responses suggested familiarity with high-stress decision-making scenarios. The final confirmation came when Rodriguez accessed the classified database of military personnel who had been declared killed in action during sensitive operations, searching for any individuals whose physical characteristics and background might match Sarah Martinez's actual identity. The search parameters were highly specific. Female pilot, approximately 32 years old, involved in experimental aircraft programs, declared dead during classified missions approximately 4 years ago. Only one record matched all the criteria. But that single file contained information that made Rodriguez's blood run cold as she realized the true magnitude of what Thompson had been doing during his systematic humiliation of the woman he considered an ignorant administrator. The classified record belonged to Captain Sarah Torres, callsign Phoenix, experimental test pilot for the Aurora program, a black project so sensitive that its very existence was known only to a handful of senior officials in the Pentagon and White House. Captain Torres had been officially declared killed in action during a classified mission involving hostile orbital weapons platforms. Her death reported as the result of catastrophic vehicle failure during experimental flight operations beyond Earth's atmosphere. But according to the medical data Rodriguez had uncovered, Captain Sarah Torres was very much alive and had been serving coffee to people who had no idea they were in the presence of one of the most elite pilots in military history. Rodriguez stared at the classified photograph of Captain Torres in her flight suit, comparing it to the woman who had spent months enduring Thompson's cruel demonstrations of intellectual superiority. The facial bone structure was identical despite the civilian disguise, but the eyes were what confirmed the identification beyond any doubt. The same intelligence, the same controlled intensity, the same hint of capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a misplaced administrator with unusual technical knowledge. She was a ghost, a legend who had been declared dead to protect operational security, hiding in plain sight while maintaining the deepest possible cover identity. And Commander Thompson had been systematically humiliating someone who's forgotten Accomplishments included missions that had redefined the boundaries of human flight capability. Rodriguez understood that she was facing a decision that would have consequences extending far beyond Peterson Space Force Base, because revealing Sarah's true identity would expose one of the most classified programs in military history, while potentially destroying the cover that had kept the national asset safe for 4 years. But keeping the secret meant allowing Thompson's cruelty to continue against someone who deserved recognition rather than humiliation. The choice became even more complicated when Rodriguez realized that circumstances were already aligning to force Sarah's hand, because intelligence reports were indicating orbital threats that would require exactly the kind of expertise that only Captain Sarah Torres possessed. The storm that Thompson had been creating through his systematic humiliation was about to encounter a crisis that would demand capabilities he didn't know existed, piloted by someone he had never bothered to truly see. The crisis began with emergency klaxons shattering the routine morning atmosphere at Peterson Space Force Base, their urgent wailing cutting through ordinary administrative tasks like a blade through silk. Sarah looked up from her computer screen as personnel throughout Building 47 received simultaneous alerts on their secure communication devices, their faces shifting from casual professionalism to focused urgency as classified information flooded through military networks. The familiar tightening in her chest told her that whatever was unfolding would be significant, enough to disrupt the careful balance she had maintained for 4 years. Colonel Michael Foster burst through the conference room doors at 0847 hours, his usually composed demeanor replaced by the controlled tension of someone delivering catastrophic intelligence to subordinates who weren't prepared for what they were about to hear. Behind him followed a stream of senior officers whose expressions carried the grim weight of people facing threats that exceeded their current capabilities. Sarah continued organizing briefing materials while her trained instincts automatically cataloged every detail of their body language, recognizing the specific patterns that indicated imminent combat operations. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a confirmed hostile orbital weapons platform approaching geosynchronous altitude over North America, Colonel Foster announced, his voice cutting through ambient noise with the precision of someone who had delivered similar briefings during previous crises. Intelligence indicates this platform possesses kinetic bombardment capabilities that could devastate critical infrastructure targets across the continental United States. Sarah's hands maintained their steady document arrangement while her mind processed implications that made her blood freeze in her veins. Orbital kinetic bombardment meant weaponized satellites capable of dropping tungsten rods with the destructive force of nuclear weapons but without the radiation signature that would trigger international retaliation protocols. The technology existed in theoretical form at several classified research facilities, but no one had believed hostile forces possessed operational capability. Thompson straightened in his chair with the focused attention of someone suddenly facing real combat scenarios rather than theoretical exercises, though Sarah could see the underlying uncertainty in his posture that suggested he was processing information beyond his practical experience. "Sir, what are our response capabilities against orbital weapons platforms?" he asked, his voice carrying forced confidence that didn't quite mask his growing realization that conventional military responses might prove inadequate. "That's exactly the problem, Commander," Colonel Foster replied with brutal honesty that Sarah recognized from briefings about impossible tactical situations. "Our satellite defense systems were designed to handle conventional threats, not weaponized platforms with advanced stealth capabilities and kinetic bombardment systems. Every countermeasure we've deployed has proven ineffective against technology that operates beyond our current detection parameters." Dr. Amanda Foster entered the room carrying classified materials that she spread across the conference table with the urgent efficiency of someone briefing desperate colleagues about insurmountable technical challenges. The orbital platform. is using adaptive camouflage technology that renders it essentially invisible to our tracking systems, she explained while displaying electromagnetic readings that showed nothing but empty space where hostile weapons should have appeared. We know it's there because of gravitational perturbations affecting other satellites, but we can't target what we can't see. Sarah absorbed this information while maintaining her administrative routine, but her trained mind was automatically calculating orbital mechanics, weapons deployment timelines, and potential countermeasures with the precision of someone who had faced similar threats in classified operations that these officers would never be briefed about. The technology Dr. Foster was describing matched capabilities that Sarah had encountered during her final mission as Captain Torres, advanced systems that officially didn't exist in any military database. Lieutenant Hayes voiced the question. That made Sarah's chest tighten with dangerous familiarity, her words carrying the desperation of someone who understood they were facing technological superiority that rendered conventional responses obsolete. Dr. Foster, if we can't see this weapons platform, how can we possibly neutralize it before it begins kinetic bombardment operations? The silence that followed was heavy with implications that no one wanted to articulate openly, though Sarah understood exactly what tactical options remained available to commanders facing impossible scenarios. Dr. Foster's expression showed the helplessness of someone who possessed comprehensive theoretical knowledge but no practical solutions to problems that existed beyond current engineering capabilities. Our most advanced interceptor spacecraft lack the orbital maneuvering capability to reach geosynchronous altitude, Dr. Foster admitted with the professional frustration of someone delivering impossible news to people who needed solutions rather than explanations. Even if we could achieve intercept trajectory, conventional weapon systems would prove ineffective against platform shielding that's designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts and cosmic radiation. Colonel Foster consulted his secure tablet. While receiving real-time updates from NORAD command centers, his face growing more grim as additional intelligence confirmed the scope of threats they were facing. The orbital platform will achieve optimal bombardment position in approximately 6 hours, he announced with controlled urgency. Primary targets appear to include NORAD facilities, Pentagon communications networks, and classified research installations across Colorado, Virginia, and Nevada. Sarah continued her document organization while mentally calculating intercept possibilities, orbital insertion requirements, and weapon system specifications that would be necessary to neutralize threats operating at the intersection of space technology and military engineering. The hostile platform's capabilities matched systems she had tested during Aurora program missions, experimental technology that existed decades beyond anything these officers understood. Major Rodriguez, who had been observing Sarah's unconscious behavioral responses throughout the briefing, noticed subtle changes that confirmed her growing suspicions about Sarah's true identity. Sarah's breathing had shifted to combat preparation patterns. Her posture showed the controlled readiness that elite pilots maintain during pre-mission briefings, and her eyes displayed the focused calculation that suggested she was processing tactical information rather than administrative details. Thompson dominated the subsequent discussion with theoretical strategies and conventional responses that Sarah knew would prove completely inadequate against the threats they were facing. His confident demeanor masking fundamental misunderstanding of the technological challenges involved in orbital combat operations. He explained satellite positioning tactics that might work against conventional threats, proposed coordinated defense strategies that assumed capabilities they didn't possess, and outlined response protocols that would result in catastrophic failure against enemies operating beyond current military parameters. We need to coordinate with Space Command for enhanced satellite surveillance, Thompson declared with authority that impressed junior officers, but revealed his complete ignorance of the actual situation they were facing. Our existing detection network should be sufficient to track hostile platforms once we implement proper scanning protocols and frequency analysis. Sarah wanted to explain that enhanced surveillance would prove useless against adaptive camouflage technology that actively manipulated electromagnetic signatures. But Sarah Martinez wasn't supposed to understand classified stealth systems that existed beyond conventional military knowledge. She continued serving coffee while listening to strategies that would result in mission failure and potentially catastrophic civilian casualties. The discussion escalated when Dr. Park joined the briefing via secure video conference, bringing additional expertise in hypersonic flight dynamics, but also delivering news that made the situation even more desperate. The orbital platform is equipped with deployment systems that could release kinetic penetrators across multiple target coordinates. Simultaneously, he explained while displaying classified analysis of weapon signatures detected through gravitational monitoring. We're looking at potential destruction of every critical military installation on the continental United States within a single bombardment sequence. Captain Chun raised concerns about civilian evacuation procedures and emergency response protocols, questions that revealed the underlying assumption that military countermeasures would prove inadequate to prevent the attack. Sarah understood that they were discussing damage mitigation rather than threat neutralization, planning for inevitable catastrophe rather than exploring options for mission success. Dr. Park, what would be required to neutralize this orbital platform? Colonel Foster asked with the desperate hope of someone seeking impossible solutions to insurmountable problems. The question hung in the air while technical experts consulted. Classified databases and theoretical research that provided no practical answers to threats that existed beyond current technological capabilities. Successful intercept would require spacecraft capable of reaching geosynchronous altitude while maintaining combat effectiveness in zero-gravity environments. Dr. Park replied with scientific precision that offered no hope for immediate solutions. The pilot would need extensive experience with orbital maneuvering systems, weapons deployment in vacuum conditions, and navigation techniques that compensate for electromagnetic interference from the platform's stealth technology. Sarah's grip tightened on the coffee pot she was holding as Dr. Park described exactly the mission parameters she had trained for during Aurora program operations, capabilities that existed only in classified facilities that these officers would never access. She had piloted experimental spacecraft through similar scenarios, neutralized orbital threats using weapons systems that officially didn't exist, and survived missions that required combining theoretical knowledge with practical skills these experts could barely imagine. Major Rodriguez watched Sarah's involuntary response to Dr. Park's technical requirements, recognizing the subtle body language changes that indicated recognition rather than confusion. Sarah's eyes had shown the focused calculation of someone mentally reviewing mission parameters. Her posture had shifted to the ready stance that combat pilots maintain during tactical briefings, and her breathing pattern had adopted the controlled rhythm that indicated preparation for high-stress operations. The technological requirements alone would be insurmountable, Dr. Foster added with professional disappointment. We would need pilot training that simply doesn't exist in current military programs, spacecraft capabilities that remain purely theoretical, and weapon systems that exceed our current engineering parameters by decades. Thompson seized upon this technical discussion as another opportunity to demonstrate his expertise to subordinates who were learning that conventional knowledge proved inadequate when facing threats that operated beyond normal military parameters. The complexity of orbital combat operations explains why qualified officers require years of specialized training, he announced while gesturing towards Sarah with familiar dismissiveness. These missions demand capabilities that civilian personnel could never comprehend, mathematical skills that exceed basic educational backgrounds, and strategic thinking that develops only through advanced military experience. But Sarah Torres, call sign Phoenix, had possessed exactly the capabilities that Dr. Park and Dr. Foster were describing as impossible, and she was standing 3 feet away from people who desperately needed solutions that only she could provide. The question was whether 4 years of systematic humiliation had created enough motivation for her to risk revealing capabilities that could save the continental United States from catastrophic attack, or whether operational security would prove more important than preventing the deaths of millions of innocent civilians. The crisis was forcing Sarah toward a decision that would shatter her carefully maintained cover identity while potentially exposing one of the most classified programs in military history. But the alternative was watching helplessly as hostile forces demonstrated technological superiority that would reshape global power structures permanently. Time was running out, and the invisible administrator serving coffee to people who had never bothered to learn her real name was perhaps the only person within 1,000 miles who possessed the capabilities they desperately needed and would never think to request. Sarah Martinez set down the coffee pot with deliberate precision and walked slowly toward the conference table, where military officers were planning responses that would result in catastrophic failure. For the first time in 4 years, she spoke with the authority of someone who had commanded experimental spacecraft in combat situations that these officers couldn't imagine, her voice carrying a weight of certainty that made every person in the room turn to stare at her with complete incomprehension. "Colonel Foster," Sarah said quietly, her posture straightening into military bearing that had been hidden beneath years of institutional invisibility. "I know how to neutralize that orbital platform." The words hung in the air like lightning before thunder, creating a moment of absolute silence that stretched across seconds while minds struggled to process what had just occurred. Thompson stared at Sarah with the bewildered expression of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by a single sentence, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger as he realized that his systematic humiliation campaign had been directed at someone whose capabilities exceeded his wildest imagination. "Martinez, this is completely inappropriate. Return to your duties immediately and leave strategic planning to qualified personnel." But Sarah was no longer the invisible administrator who had endured months of cruel demonstrations about her supposed ignorance. She reached beneath her cardigan and withdrew identification credentials that she had carried for 4 years without ever expecting to use them. Military documentation that would validate claims no one in the room was prepared to accept. "My name is Captain Sarah Torres, callsign Phoenix, Aurora Program Test Pilot," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the carefully constructed facade of Sarah Martinez began dissolving into the legendary reality of someone who had pushed experimental aircraft beyond theoretical limitations. Authorization code Ultra Black 947 Delta, current as of today's authentication cycle. Colonel Foster's hands trembled as he entered Sarah's codes into his secure tablet, his expression showing the disbelief of someone witnessing resurrection. As the authentication system processed credentials that belonged to someone who had been officially declared dead 4 years ago, the verification process took 43 seconds that felt like hours, and when the results appeared on his screen, his face went completely pale. "Captain Sarah Torres, callsign Phoenix," he read aloud in a voice barely above a whisper. "Aurora. Program experimental test pilot, security clearance Ultra Black, presumed killed in action during classified orbital operations 4 years ago." He looked up at Sarah with something approaching religious awe. "According to this database, you died during a mission that officially never happened." Sarah's smile carried the cold professionalism of someone who had survived situations that would have killed ordinary pilots. Her transformation from humble administrator to legendary aviator now complete and irreversible. "Death was operationally necessary, Colonel. The mission required complete disappearance from all official records, and sometimes the most effective way to vanish is to let everyone believe you no longer exist." Major Rodriguez felt vindication surge through her as months of careful observation suddenly made perfect sense. Her intelligence training finally providing answers to behavioral anomalies that had defied logical explanation. The woman she had suspected of possessing hidden expertise was actually one of the most elite pilots in military history, someone whose forgotten accomplishments included missions that had redefined the boundaries of human flight capability. Amanda Foster stared at Sarah with scientific fascination mixed with growing hope, because the Aurora program represented technology that existed decades beyond current aerospace engineering. Captain Torres, if you're really Aurora program, then you have experience with spacecraft that could theoretically reach orbital combat altitudes. But those vehicles were experimental prototypes that pushed pilots beyond human endurance limits. Sarah's expression showed the confidence of someone who had not only survived those limits, but had exceeded them, repeatedly during missions that existed at the intersection of science and impossibility. Dr. Foster, I spent 3 years testing Aurora prototypes in environments where theoretical limitations meant death in the vacuum of space. The technology you're describing as experimental has been operational longer than most of these officers have been commissioned. Thompson's face showed a mixture of humiliation and desperate denial as he struggled to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and intellectual superiority. This is impossible. You're a civilian. Administrator, you serve coffee and file paperwork. You don't understand basic aviation concepts. Commander Thompson, Sarah replied with patient authority, I served you coffee while you explained orbital mechanics that I had mastered through practical application before you completed your first space operations course. One filed reports about missions that I had personally flown, and I listened to your lectures about aircraft capabilities that I had tested beyond their theoretical parameters. The revelation hit the assembled officers like a physical blow, but Sarah wasn't finished explaining the magnitude of Thompson's mistake. She had endured months of systematic humiliation from someone whose expertise was purely theoretical, suffering public degradation from a man who had never faced the terrifying reality of combat beyond Earth's atmosphere. Dr. Park joined the conversation via secure video link, his scientific excitement barely contained as he realized he was speaking with someone who possessed practical experience with technology that remained theoretical to most researchers. Captain Torres, the Aurora program was terminated under circumstances that made detailed study impossible. What can you tell us about spacecraft capabilities that might be relevant to our current crisis? Sarah moved to the wall display showing satellite tracking data, her hands automatically manipulating controls with the fluid expertise of someone who had operated similar systems under combat conditions. The hostile orbital platform is using adaptive stealth technology that I encountered during my final Aurora mission. The weapons system, electromagnetic signatures, and deployment patterns all match technology that I helped neutralize 4 years ago. She began calling up classified database information that required clearances beyond anything possessed by most personnel present, her fingers moving across control interfaces with muscle memory that revealed years of experience with systems these officers had never seen. The data she accessed showed Aurora program specifications that officially didn't exist, experimental spacecraft that had been declared impossible by conventional aerospace engineering. The Aurora X-7 prototype is stored in Hangar Delta 7 at Cheyenne Mountain. Sarah continued with the calm authority of someone who had piloted similar vehicles through impossible missions. It's the only spacecraft ever built that can achieve orbital combat capability while maintaining stealth characteristics that exceed hostile detection systems. Colonel Foster consulted real-time intelligence updates while trying to process the impossibility of what he was witnessing. His secure communications revealing that conventional military responses had already proven completely inadequate. Captain Torres, our satellite defense networks report no success in tracking or intercepting the hostile platform. Every countermeasure has failed, and kinetic bombardment will commence in less than 4 hours. Sarah nodded with grim understanding of tactical situations that demanded impossible solutions from people who possessed capabilities beyond normal human limitations. Colonel, conventional spacecraft can't reach geosynchronous combat altitude with sufficient fuel reserves for sustained operations. The Aurora X-7 uses hybrid propulsion that transitions from atmospheric to orbital flight regimes, but it requires pilot skills that don't exist in current military training programs. Dr. Foster raised the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to articulate, her voice carrying the desperation of someone seeking hope in situations that defied optimistic outcomes. Captain Torres, are you saying you can pilot this Aurora spacecraft in current operational conditions? It's been 4 years since your last flight, and according to official records, your final mission ended in catastrophic failure. Sarah's laugh was sharp and professional, carrying the confidence of someone whose survival had required capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Dr. Foster, I wasn't declared dead because my mission failed. I was declared dead because my mission succeeded so completely that continued existence would have compromised operational security for decades. She moved toward the exit with the purposeful stride of someone preparing for combat operations, her transformation from invisible administrator to legendary pilot now complete. The Aurora X-7 isn't just experimental technology. It's a weapons system designed to fight wars that haven't been officially acknowledged. And today it's going to demonstrate why some missions require capabilities that exist beyond conventional military understanding. Thompson made one last desperate attempt to maintain his authority over someone he had systematically humiliated for months, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose entire professional identity was crumbling. Captain Torres, even if your credentials are authentic, you cannot simply commandeer classified spacecraft for unauthorized operations. Military protocol requires proper authorization through chain of command. Sarah turned back to address the man who had spent months mocking her supposed ignorance about subjects where her expertise exceeded his by decades, her expression showing the patient authority of someone who had commanded operations that Thompson couldn't imagine. Commander, in approximately 3 hours and 47 minutes, kinetic penetrators will begin falling on every critical military installation in North America. Your concern about protocol will seem remarkably insignificant when you're trying to coordinate defensive operations from a crater. Colonel Foster made the decision that would save millions of lives while potentially exposing the most classified program in military history, his voice carrying the weight of command authority that transcended normal operational procedures. Captain Torres, you have full authorization for whatever resources you need. But I have to ask, are you certain you can pilot Aurora technology after 4 years of civilian life? Sarah's smile showed the quiet confidence of someone who had never truly left service, merely changed uniforms while waiting for the moment when her country would need capabilities that only she possessed. Colonel, heroes don't retire from duty. We just modify our operational parameters and prepare for missions that require us to remember who we really are. The military convoy screened through Colorado mountain highways at speeds that turned landscapes into blurred impressions of pine forests and granite peaks. Sarah's transformation from administrative coordinator to combat pilot accelerating with every mile toward Cheyenne Mountain. She sat in the passenger seat with combat composure that had been dormant but never absent, her mind automatically reviewing flight procedures and weapon systems that she had mastered during missions that officially had never occurred. Cheyenne Mountain Aerospace Defense Complex appeared ahead like a fortress carved from living rock, its massive blast doors concealing technology that represented decades of classified research into systems that existed beyond public understanding of military capabilities. Sarah could see Aurora program personnel emerging from hidden positions throughout the facility, their movements showing the practiced efficiency of technicians who had maintained experimental spacecraft during her 4-year absence. Captain Torres, the lead technician, called out as Sarah approached Hangar Delta 7. All systems have been maintained in full operational status per standing Aurora protocols. Fuel load is maximum, weapons are armed, and adaptive stealth skin is calibrated for current orbital conditions. His words carried the relief of someone who had been waiting years for the return of the only pilot qualified to operate technology that pushed human capabilities beyond theoretical limitations. The Aurora X-7 emerged from its concealed storage bay like a sculpture of controlled violence, its exotic surfaces seeming to absorb light while maintaining aerodynamic lines that suggested capabilities far beyond conventional aircraft. Sarah approached the spacecraft with reverent familiarity, her hands automatically conducting pre-flight inspections that revealed intimate knowledge of systems these officers had never seen. "How long since your last Aurora flight?" Major Rodriguez asked, having accompanied the convoy to witness what promised to be either miraculous salvation or catastrophic failure. Her intelligence training demanded answers to questions about operational readiness after extended inactive periods. Sarah's response was delivered while she completed external systems checks with methodical precision that revealed muscle memory developed through hundreds of similar preparations. 4 years, 7 months, 12 days. But Aurora pilots don't lose capabilities through inactivity because the neural interface technology creates permanent connections between human consciousness and spacecraft systems. She climbed into the cockpit with fluid grace that demonstrated unconscious familiarity with environments that existed at the intersection of human capability and technological impossibility. The Aurora's interior defied conventional understanding of aircraft design, its control surfaces appearing to merge organic curves with technological functionality that seemed almost alien in sophistication. "Aurora Control, this is Phoenix requesting immediate launch clearance for orbital intercept mission." Sarah's voice transmitted clearly through communication systems as she initiated startup sequences that filled the hangar with sounds like controlled lightning. "Hostile platform is approaching optimal bombardment position, and conventional countermeasures have proven ineffective." "Phoenix, this is Aurora Control," came the response from operators who had maintained readiness for her return throughout 4 years of official death. "You are cleared for immediate launch on any trajectory. All airspace is yours, and may the stars guide you home." Sarah's engines began generating thrust that appeared to violate several laws of physics while maintaining perfect stability. Their exotic propulsion creating atmospheric effects that suggested technologies decades beyond current aerospace engineering. The Aurora X-7 lifted from the hangar floor without visible external support, its adaptive stealth skin beginning the transition to orbital camouflage parameters. "Colonel Foster," Sarah transmitted as the Aurora accelerated toward atmospheres edge with impossible grace. "You're about to witness why Aurora program pilots were considered mythical, even among people who knew we existed. Some storms arrive from directions that enemy forces never see coming." The spacecraft vanished from all detection systems as Sarah began her ascent toward geosynchronous orbit, her consciousness merging with Aurora technology that responded to thought as quickly as physical control inputs. Within minutes, she had achieved orbital insertion altitude while maintaining complete electromagnetic invisibility, her approach vector calculated to intercept the hostile weapons platform from angles that conventional spacecraft couldn't achieve. The battle for North American satellite infrastructure was about to begin, fought between technologies that officially didn't exist, piloted by someone who was supposed to be dead, in airspace that would never appear in official military records. But the people watching from ground installations would never forget the moment they learned that some heroes announced their return, not with fanfare and recognition, but by materializing from impossible darkness to save everything their countrymen held dear. Sarah Torres, call sign Phoenix, had risen from administrative invisibility to demonstrate why certain legends never truly die, bringing capabilities that exceeded imagination while proving that the most valuable guardians are often the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for moments when extraordinary skill becomes absolutely necessary for national survival. The hostile orbital platform discovered too late that it had chosen to threaten a nation protected by someone who's forgotten. Accomplishments included missions that had redefined the boundaries of human flight capability and whose return to active duty would remind enemies everywhere that America's greatest weapons are often the ones that nobody sees coming. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.